Joyce had his Dublin, Marquez had his Macondo County, Faulkner had his Yuknapakpa. Gosh. Good bedfellows all. The dust out of which Kennedy builds his world, and indeed his whole notion of time, is, of course, Albany. Sooner or later, we all find ourselves on the corner of State and Pearl.
People wanted me to read the first chapter of Iron Wing, and it's too long, way too long. So I've been hacking at it, and in the meantime I have to go to doctors and one thing and another. And anyway, I'll read my cut-up version of it. And I can only find the beginning. All right, here we are. I need water. Riding up the winding road of St. Agnes Cemetery in the back of a rattling old truck, Francis Phelan became aware that the dead, even more than the living, settled down in neighborhoods. The truck was suddenly surrounded by fields of monuments and cenotaphs of kindred design and striking size, all guarding the privileged dead. But the truck moved on, and the limits of the mere privilege became visible. For here now came the acres of truly prestigious death. Illustrious men and women, captains of life, without their diamonds, furs, carriages, and limousines, but buried in pomp and glory, vaulted in great tombs built like heavenly safe deposit, or parts of the Acropolis. And yes, here too, inevitably, came the flowing masses, row upon row of them, under simple headstones and simpler crosses. Here was the neighborhood of the Phelans. Francis's mother twitched nervously in her grave as the truck carried him nearer to her, and Francis's father lit his pipe, smiled at his wife's discomfort, and looked out from his own bit of sod to catch a glimpse of how much his son had changed since the train accident. His father was killed in a train, hit by a moving train. He was a railroad worker. Francis's father smoked the roots of grass and crouched afflicted the cemetery. He stored the root essence in his pockets until it was brittle to the touch, then pulverized it between his fingers and packed his pipe. Francis's mother wove crosses from the dead dandelions and other deep-rooted weeds, careful to preserve their fullest length. She wove them while they were still in the green stage of death, and then ate them with an insatiable revulsion. Rudy was sober for a change. Rudy is Francis's buddy, was a bum. And his gray hair was combed and trimmed. His mustache was clipped, and he wore white suede shoes, even though it was October. What the hell? He was just a bum. And a white shirt and a crease in his pants. Francis, no lace in one of his shoes, hair matted and uncut, smelling his own body stink and ashamed of it for the first time in ever life. "You're looking good there, bum," Francis said. "I've been in a hospital." "What for?" "Cancer." No shit. Cancer? He says to me, you're going to die in 6 months. I says, I'm going to whine myself to death. He says, it don't make any difference if you whined or died. You're going out of this world with a cancer. The stomach, it's like pits, you know? You know what I mean? I said, I'd like to make it to 50. The doc says, you'll never make it. I said, all right, what's the difference? And Francis says, too bad, Grandma. You got a jug? I got $1 business, Francis. But then he remembered his debt to Marcus Gorman, who told him to go get the job in the cemetery. Listen, bum, he said, you want to go to work with me and make a few bucks? We can get a couple of jugs and a flop tonight. It's going to be cold. Look at that sky. Work where? The cemetery, shoveling dirt. The cemetery? Why not? I ought to get used to it. What are they paying? Who the hell knows? I mean, they paying money or they give you a free grave when you croak? If it ain't money, forget it, Francis said. I ain't shoveling out my own grave. Francis, oh, yeah. Hey, said Rudy. Excuse me. Hey, said Rudy. What the hell was all that about the man from Mars last night? Everybody was talking about it at the hospital. You hear about that stuff on the radio? Oh, yeah, they landed. Who? The Martians. Where'd they land? Someplace in Jersey. What happened? They didn't like it no more than I did. No joke, Rudy said. I heard people saw them Martians coming and ran out of towns, everything like that. Good, said Francis. What they ought to do, anybody sees a Martian ought to jump out 2 windows. You don't take things serious, Rudy said. You have a, what do you call it, a frivolous way about you. A frivolous way? A frivolous way? That's what I said, a frivolous way. What the hell does that mean? You've been reading again, you crazy crowd? I told you cuckoos like you shouldn't go around reading calling people frivolous. That ain't no insult. Frivolous is a good word, a nice word. Never mind words. There's the cemetery. I just thought of something. What? That cemetery's full of gravestones. Right. I never knew a bum yet had a gravestone. And of course, he's a bum, and Rudy's a bum, and their culture is the bum culture of America in 1938. They walked up the long entrance road from Broadway to the cemetery proper. Francis sweet-talked the woman at the gatehouse and mentioned Marcus Gorman, the lawyer, and introduced Rudy as a good worker like himself, ready to work. She said the truck would be along and just wait easy. And then he and Rudy rode up in the back of the truck and got busy with the dirt. They'd rested when they'd filled all the hollows of the graves, and then by then the truck driver was nowhere to be found. So they sat there and looked down the hill toward Broadway and over toward the hills of Rensselaer and Troy on the other side of the Hudson. Francis decided this would be a nice, fine place to be buried. The hill had a nice flow to it that carried you down the grass and out onto the river and then across the water and up through the trees and the far shore to the top of the hills in one big swoop. Being dead here would situate a man in place and time. It would give a man neighbors, even so to really old folks like those antique dead ones at the foot of the lawn. Tobias Mannion, Elisha Skinner, Elsie Whipple, all crumbling under their limestone headstones from which the snows, sands, and acids of reduction were slowly removing their names. Francis recognized the hill where his family was buried, for it was just over from the sword-bearing guardian angel who stood on tiptoe atop 3 marble steps, guarding the grave of Toby, the dwarf who died heroically in the Delavan Hotel fire of '94. Old Ed Doherty, the writer, bought that monument for Toby when it came out in the paper that Toby's grave had no marker. Toby's angel pointed down the hill toward Michael Phelan's grave, and Francis found it with his gaze. His mother would be alongside the old man, probably with her back to him. Fishwife. It's okay with me if I don't have no headstone, Francis said to Ruby, just so as I don't die alone. No headstone, Francis said to Ruby, just so as I don't die alone. You die before me, I'll send out invites, Ruby said. Catherine Phelan, suddenly aware her worthless son was no accepting his own death, provided it arrived on a gregarious note, humphed and fumed her disapproval to her husband. But Michael Phelan was already following the line of his son's walk toward the plot beneath the box elder tree where Gerald was buried. It always amazed Michael that the living could move instinctually toward dead kin without knowledge of their location. Francis had never seen Gerald's grave, had not attended Gerald's funeral. His absence that day was the scandal of the resident population. But here he was now, walking purposefully and with a slight limp Michael had not seen before, closing the gap between father and son. And Michael signaled to his neighbors that an act of regeneration seemed to be in process. And the eyes of the dead, witnesses all to their own historical omissions, their own unbridgeable chasms in life gone, silently rooted for Francis as he walked up the slope toward the box elder. Ruby followed his pal at a respectful distance, aware that some event of moment was taking place. Hangdog, he observed. In his grave, a cruciformed circle, Gerald watched the advent of the father and considered what action might be appropriate to their meeting. Should he absolve the man of all guilt? Not for the dropping, for that was accidental, but for the abandonment of the family, for craven flight when the steadfast virtues were called for. Gerald's grave trembled with superb possibility. Denied speech in life, having died with only monosyllabic goos and gahs in his vocabulary, Gerald possessed the gift of tongues in death. His ability to communicate and to understand was at the genius level among the dead. He could speak with any resident adult in any language, but more notable was his ability to understand the chattery squirrels and chipmunks, the silent signals of the ants and beetles, and the slithy semaphores of the slugs and worms that moved above and through his earth. He could read the waning of energy in the leaves and berries as they fell from the box elder above him. And because his fate had been innocence and denial, Gerald had grown a protective web which deflected all moisture, all moles, rabbits, and other burrowing creatures. His web was woven of strands of vivid silver and an enveloping hammock of intricate, near transparent, and absolved of the need to decay, but in some respects, a full head of hair, for instance, it had grown to a completeness that was both natural and miraculous. Gerald rested in his infantile sublimity, exuding a high gloss induced by early death, his skin a radiant white gold, his nails a silvery gray, his cluster of curls and large eyes perfectly matched in gleaming ebony. Swaddled in his grave, he was beyond capture by visual or verbal artistry. He was neither beautiful nor perfect to the beholder, but rather ineffably fabulous. But life was not to be found anywhere in the cemetery, and it abounded with dead innocents. Francis found the grave without a search. He stood over it and reconstructed the moment when the child was slipping through his fingers into death. He prayed for a repeal of time so that he might hang himself in the coal bin before picking up the child to change his diaper. Denied that, he prayed for his son's eternal peace in the grave. It was true the boy had not suffered at all in his short life, and he had died too quickly of a cracked neck bone to have felt pain. A sudden twist and it was over. Gerald Michael Phelan, the gravestone said, April 13, 1916. Died April 26, 1916. Born on the 13th, lived 13 days, an unlucky child who was much loved. Tears oozed from Francis's eyes, and when one of them fell onto his shoe top, he pitched forward onto the grave, clutching the grass, remembering the diaper in his grip. It had smelled of Gerald's pungent water, and when he squeezed it with his horrified right hand, a drop of the sacred fluid fell onto his shoe top. 22 years gone, and Francis could now, in panoramic memory, see, hear, and feel every detail. From the time he left the car barns after work, to his talk about baseball with Bunk Dunn and King Brady's saloon, and even the walk home with Cap Lawler, who said Brady's beer was getting a heady taste to it, and Brady ought to clean his pipes, and that the Taylor kid next door to the Lawlers was passing green pinworms. I remember everything, Francis told Gerald in the grave. It's the first time I tried to think of those things since you died. I had 4 beers after work that day. It wasn't because I was drunk that I dropped you. 4 beers, and I didn't finish the 4th. Left it to the pigs, next to the pig's feet jar on Brady's bar with Cap Lawler. Billy was 9 then. He knew you were gone before Peggy knew. She hadn't come home from choir practice yet. Your mother said 2 words, sweet Jesus. And then we both crouched down to snatch you up. But we both stopped in that crouch because of the looks of you. Billy came in then and saw you. Why is Gerald crooked? He says. You know, I saw Billy a week or so ago, and the kid looks good. He wanted to buy me new clothes. Bailed me out of jail, he did, and he didn't give me a wad of cash. We talked about you. He says your mother never blamed me for drugs. All the soul in 22 years, it was me letting you fall. Is that some woman or isn't it? I remember the linoleum you fell on was yellow with red squares. You suppose now that I can remember this stuff out in the open, I can finally start to forget it? Gerald, through an act of silent will, imposed on his father the pressing obligation to perform his final acts of expiation for abandoning the family. You will not know, the child silently said, what these acts are until you have performed them all. And after you have performed them, you will not understand that they were expiatory, but understood all the other expiation that has kept you in such prolonged humiliation. Then, when these final acts are complete, you will stop trying to die because of me. Francis stopped crying and tried to suck a small piece of bread out from between the last two molars in his all but toothless mouth. He made a slurping sound with his tongue, and when he did, a squirrel, scratching the earth for food to store up for the winter, spiraled up the box elder in sudden fright. Francis took this as a signal to conclude his visit, and he turned his gaze toward the stand of white fleece, brutally bright, moved south to north in the eastern vault of the heavens. A rush of splendid wool to warm the day. The breeze had grown temperate, and the sun was rising to the noonday pitch. Francis was no longer chilly. "Hey, Bum," he called to Rudy, "let's find that truck driver." "What have you been up to?" Rudy asked. "You know somebody buried up there?" "A little kid I used to know." "A kid? What did he do? Die young?" "Pretty young." "What happened to him?" "He fell. He fell on the floor." "Hell, I fall on the floor about twice a day and I ain't dead." That's what you think, Francis.
William Kennedy.